Welcome back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into the life of Allen Dulles.
Head of the CIA.
During the Cold War, yeah. And the book we're using to guide us is The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. And it's a book that goes into some pretty controversial areas of his life, both personal and professional.
You know, what's really interesting about this book is that it goes beyond the usual spy stories and dives into how Dulles' actions, both in his professional and personal life, really impacted world events, you know?
Yeah.
It tries to understand how his worldview and his personality really shaped his approach to intelligence and how that shaped history.
Okay, so before we even get into, like, the cloak and dagger stuff, I think one of the things that the book really brings up is how Dulles and his brother, John Foster Dulles, they had this very unique perspective on democracy.
Yeah, they didn't really see it as this ideal system where everyone had a say. They thought that it needed to be managed by
like elites.
Elites, right? People like themselves, yeah.
Yeah.
And they saw themselves as the architects of American foreign policy.
Working kind of behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that that's fascinating because it kind of sets the stage for their sometimes contentious relationship with President Kennedy.
Absolutely. I mean, Kennedy represented this new generation.
A new way of thinking.
Yeah, more idealistic, less willing to accept the Cold War status quo.
Right.
They clashed on a lot of issues like nuclear strategy, support for national liberation movements.
Right.
Kennedy really envisioned a very different path for America, and it really challenged the power structure that Dulles represented.
It's kind of crazy that Kennedy kept Dulles on as CIA chief, despite their fundamental disagreements.
It really shows how much power Dulles had built up in the intelligence community. Even someone like Kennedy couldn't easily remove him, but their conflict eventually, you know, exploded with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was this colossal failure.
Right.
That really tarnished Kennedy's presidency and put Dulles right in the hot seat.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Bay of Pigs a little. The book describes some pretty suspicious behavior on Dulles' part during this whole operation.
Yeah, so here's where things get interesting. During the actual invasion, Dulles was conspicuously absent from Washington. Like, he was conveniently out of contact when everything went wrong. And later, he even tried to shift the blame onto his deputy, Richard Bissell.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right.
Except it's real life with big consequences.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, to make matters even more strange, Dulles ends up on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's assassination.
Right, like, imagine.
It doesn't make sense.
The man who was fired by Kennedy, who had been involved in covert operations against the Kennedy administration, is now leading the investigation into his death.
Right.
I mean, that raises so many questions.
And the book points out that, like, the American press at the time really just overlooked this glaring conflict of interest.
Yeah, and the silence really speaks volumes about the power dynamics at the time, right? Dulles represented this, like the old guard, this deep state.
Right.
You know, challenging him or even questioning his motives was just not done by major media outlets. Imagine that today.
It's kind of scary.
It is. It is.
To think about, yeah. So the book takes us all the way back to Dulles' early days in espionage, starting with his time in Bern, Switzerland, during the World War II.
Yeah, and this period is important because it shows us so much about his methods and his comfort with moral ambiguity.
Okay.
I mean, he was surrounded by
spies.
Spies, exactly. Nazis, Swiss intelligence.
Yeah.
And he just, it seems like, reveled in the intrigue, you know, building relationships with all these figures across the spectrum, regardless of their ideology.
And those relationships sometimes crossed ethical lines. There's a story in the book about how he turns over his Czech mistress to British agents because they suspected she was a double agent.
Yeah, it's a really stark example of how he was willing to use people as pawns, right? Even someone he was supposedly close to. And it really underscores his cold, calculating approach to intelligence. But what's really disturbing is what he did after the war. He starts recruiting former Nazi officials. Some of them had committed serious war crimes.
Right. And the book really focuses on this case of SS General Karl Wolff. And Dulles went to, like, crazy lengths to protect him from war crimes trials. He even provided, like, a glowing character reference.
Yeah, Dulles argued that these former Nazis had this valuable knowledge about the Soviet Union, which was now the main enemy. But it raises this question, right? Does national security justify compromising moral principles?
Right.
And Dulles clearly believed it did. And his actions set this precedent for prioritizing expediency over accountability. This would become a pattern throughout his career.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that leads us to another troubling part of Dulles' legacy, and that's this whole brainwashing narrative that he pushed during the Korean War.
Right. Yeah, this is like a really chilling chapter in the book. You have American soldiers returning from captivity, and they've got these stories about the communists using these intense psychological manipulation techniques.
Exactly. And Dulles just takes this and runs with it.
Yeah.
Turns it into this huge propaganda campaign. And you have to remember, like, the fear in America at the time.
Right. Cold War.
Yeah, Cold War at its peak, the idea of brainwashing, it just played right into all those anxieties.
The book mentions this guy, Edward Hunter.
Right.
Who becomes kind of the public face of this whole thing.
Yeah, Hunter was like the self-proclaimed propaganda specialist. He really went all out.
Yeah.
Wrote these best-selling books with titles like Brainwashing in Red China, and he's giving this dramatic testimony before Congress.
Oh, wow.
Painting this picture of American soldiers being turned into these mindless robots by these sinister communist techniques.
Yeah.
It was just a masterful, really disturbing manipulation of public opinion.
So under Dulles, the CIA wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore. They were actively shaping the narrative.
Absolutely.
Using fear and propaganda to advance their own agenda.
It makes you think, right? Like how much of what we believe is actually based on reality and how much of it's just shaped by these forces we're not even aware of.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Dulles understood that power of information control, and he wasn't afraid to use it.
Yeah. And the book also gets into his involvement in all these covert operations around the world. I mean, take the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, for example.
Right. This was a major turning point.
Huge.
Set the stage for decades of turmoil in the Middle East.
Right.
Mossadegh was this democratically elected leader.
Right.
And he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which was controlled by the British.
Okay.
And the British saw this as a threat, and they went to the U.S. for help.
And Dulles, being the cold warrior that he was,
yeah,
he saw this as an opportunity to install a pro-Western regime.
Exactly. He orchestrated this coup, removed Mossadegh from power, and installed the Shah of Iran, a U.S.-backed dictator.
Right.
Now, it might have looked like a win in the short term, but
had long-term consequences.
Disastrous long-term consequences.
Yeah.
It created all this resentment that led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
Exactly.
It's a perfect example of how Dulles focused on these immediate strategic gains.
Right.
But he often ignored the complexities of local politics and culture.
Yeah.
And it led to these unintended consequences down the line.
And then there's the Congo, where the CIA, again under Dulles, was implicated in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba.
Yeah.
The country's first democratically elected prime minister.
Lumumba was a charismatic leader.
Yeah.
Really advocated for Congolese independence from Belgian colonial rule.
Right.
He was also seen as having socialist leanings.
Okay.
Which made him a target for the West during the Cold War.
The book makes a pretty strong case that the CIA played a role in his removal from power.
Absolutely.
And his eventual murder.
This event is just a brutal reminder of the realities of Cold War politics.
Yeah.
Lumumba's assassination was a turning point for the Congo.
Yeah.
Plunged the country into decades of instability and violence.
It's crazy.
It's a tragic illustration of how pursuing Cold War objectives often came at a terrible human cost.
And these events, as they're described in The Devil's Chessboard, they really make you confront the dark side of American power during this period.
Yeah, it's not easy to read about these covert operations and assassinations and manipulations.
Right.
But it's important to understand this history so we can learn from it.
Absolutely.
Talbot doesn't shy away from these difficult truths.
Yeah.
He presents the evidence and lets you draw your own conclusions.
And of course, there's the whole question of Dulles' involvement in the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's assassination.
Right. I mean, just think about it.
It's wild.
This is the guy who Kennedy fired after the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
And he ends up leading the investigation into his death. It's just a very strange situation.
The Warren Commission ultimately concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy.
Right.
Talbot raises serious questions about how thorough and objective that investigation really was.
Especially given Dulles' role in it.
Yeah.
He points to these inconsistencies and unanswered questions in the official story.
Okay.
For example, there's this mysterious figure named George de Mohrenschildt.
Right.
This shadowy character with ties to both Oswald and the CIA.
Wow.
And he gave conflicting and misleading testimony to the commission.
So de Mohrenschildt is just one of these shady figures who crossed paths with Oswald in the months leading up to the assassination, and the book really explores those connections in detail.
It makes you wonder if Oswald was really acting alone or if he was part of something bigger.
Right.
Now, Talbot doesn't come right out and endorse any specific conspiracy theory,
Right.
but he does present some pretty compelling evidence that the Warren Commission's investigation was flawed, and he wants readers to think critically about the official narrative.
Yeah.
And consider alternative explanations for what happened in Dallas.
It's fascinating and kind of unsettling.
It is.
To think that there might have been forces beyond Lee Harvey Oswald involved in Kennedy's assassination.
And it's important to remember that even some members of the Warren Commission had doubts about their own conclusions.
Really?
Yeah. The book describes this scene where Dulles is presenting his findings to a group of students, and one of them just straight up challenges him.
Wow.
Points to photographic evidence that contradicts the lone gunman theory.
And what did Dulles say to that?
Well, he dismisses the students' concerns, but
Of course.
it highlights the fact that there was skepticism about the official narrative even back then.
Right.
And Talbot gives voice to those skeptics, encourages us to participate in this ongoing debate about what really happened.
And that critical thinking is really important.
It is.
I mean, the book reminds us that history is often written by the victors.
Exactly.
And the official story isn't always the whole story.
Right. It challenges us to dig deeper, to question assumptions, and to consider multiple perspectives.
Okay, so the book also delves into the assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1968.
Right, just as he was emerging as a leading presidential candidate.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy was a powerful figure in his own right.
Absolutely.
And his assassination sent shockwaves through the country.
It did.
Talbot suggests that RFK may have been targeted by the same forces that opposed his brother's presidency.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It raises these profound questions about the nature of power and how far those in power will go to maintain control.
And Talbot argues that RFK represented a real threat to the establishment.
He did. He was a vocal critic of the Vietnam War. He was advocating for social justice and economic equality.
Right.
And his assassination, according to Talbot, silenced this powerful voice for change.
It's a reminder that challenging the status quo can be dangerous, especially when powerful interests are at stake.
Absolutely.
But you know, The Devil's Chessboard is more than just a book about conspiracies and assassinations.
Right.
It's also a really nuanced portrait of Allen Dulles himself, this man who was brilliant, but also deeply flawed.
Yeah, Talbot doesn't shy away from those complexities.
Yeah.
He was charismatic, sophisticated, but he could also be ruthless and manipulative.
Right.
He was a man of his time, someone who believed that the ends justified the means when it came to fighting communism.
The book explores his personal life as well.
It does.
His extramarital affairs, his often distant relationships with his family.
Right.
There's this striking anecdote about how he encouraged his mistress, Mary Bancroft, to accept an invitation from a Nazi double agent just to gather more intelligence.
It really shows his willingness to use people, even those close to him, as pawns in this game of espionage.
Yeah, it highlights those moral compromises he was willing to make.
In the name of national security.
Right.
His legacy is complicated.
Yeah.
He played a huge role in shaping America's Cold War strategy, but his actions had these lasting and often really detrimental consequences for the countries where he intervened.
The Devil's Chessboard leaves us with a lot to think about.
It does.
Makes us rethink our understanding of 20th century history.
Absolutely.
And to question the official narratives about some of the most important events of that era.
It's a call for transparency, accountability, and a more critical understanding of the forces that shape our world. And it's amazing how Dulles' influence didn't stop when he left the CIA. The book talks about how he kept pulling strings behind the scenes, advising presidents and influencing intelligence policy even after he was officially out.
Like he never really left.
It's like he always had a hand in things. The book mentions his close friendship with this Texas oil tycoon named Charlie Reitzman.
Oh, yeah.
Who was a big Republican donor and a key player in the Eisenhower administration. Dulles would spend time at Reitzman's fancy estates, hanging out with the elite and staying connected to those in power.
It really creates this image of like a shadow network where decisions weren't being made in official meetings, but in these private conversations and backroom deals.
It's a side of history that we don't often see, but it's so important to understanding how power actually works. And talking about power, the book doesn't shy away from the criticisms of Dulles, especially his tendency to be reckless and his belief that the CIA shouldn't really have much oversight.
He seemed to like working in the shadows, where the rules were kind of blurry.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much accountability.
Yeah, Dulles was a big believer in what he called plausible deniability.
Right.
The idea that the president shouldn't be directly involved in authorizing these covert operations so that if things went south, he could distance himself.
Which is kind of ironic considering how much he micromanaged certain operations like the Bay of Pigs.
Exactly. It shows a kind of contradiction in his approach.
Yeah.
He wanted the power to make decisions, but also the ability to not deal with the consequences. And that way of thinking really affected the culture of the CIA.
The book argues that Dulles' legacy is one of secrecy, arrogance, and this belief that the agency is above the law. And that's something we're still dealing with today, right, as we try to find a balance between national security and individual rights.
Absolutely. Dulles' methods and his way of thinking, as described in The Devil's Chessboard, raise these ethical questions that are still so relevant, like the CIA's use of propaganda and psychological warfare to sway public opinion, not just during the Korean War, but throughout the Cold War.
It's a scary thought that so much of what we think is real is shaped by forces that are working in secret.
And Dulles knew how powerful fear could be, and how to use it to justify the CIA's actions even when those actions were morally questionable or totally illegal. He was great at manipulating how the public saw things.
The book also describes how the CIA under Dulles infiltrated cultural programs. They were funding literary magazines and art exhibits, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it was this clever form of cultural warfare, meant to promote American values and undermine Soviet influence. But it also raises some uncomfortable questions about the role of intelligence agencies in shaping culture. Should they even be involved in these things? What are the ethical implications? These are things we're still grappling with.
The Devil's Chessboard is challenging read, but it's worth the effort. It shows us this hidden world of secret agreements, covert operations, and manipulations that changed the course of the 20th century. And it's a story that's still important today as we face issues of government overreach, surveillance, and the weakening of democratic values.
It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about history and question the stories we've been told. It's a call for transparency, accountability, and a more critical understanding of the forces that shape our world.
If this deep dive has piqued your interest, I highly recommend checking out The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. It's a book that will stick with you. And to make things easy, we've included an affiliate link in the episode description, where you can buy the book and support the show.
It's a must-read for anyone who wants to know more about the secret history of the Cold War and the complicated legacy of Allen Dulles.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of espionage, power, and the darker side of American history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never just accept the official story as the whole truth.